This is a secret intelligence report.
Autumn. The season came heavy with the smell of oil and rust. The airfield lay under a low gray sky, where every sound carried a hammer, striking steel, the slow churn of engines, the faint hum of distant thunder. Men moved with precision and pride, uniforms stained but pressed, faces drawn by discipline more than fatigue. At the center of it all stood their leader, a man forged by victories and near-death escapes, his gaze sharp, his silence heavier than the air itself. For years, he and those beside him had owned the skies. Their craft was not just machinery, it was the embodiment of a code, a philosophy born of skill, patience, and honor. To them, flight was not mechanics, it was mastery. Then came the report. A document passed from hand to hand bearing news of a new enemy design, larger, heavier, impossible by their standards. The room filled with low laughter, the kind drawn from certainty. They saw it as proof that the enemy still misunderstood what made a warrior. Strength, they believed, came not from armor or numbers, but from spirit, the kind that could not be built in factories or forged in blueprints. Outside, their machines gleamed in the dim light, elegant silhouettes carved from faith and memory. No one doubted what tomorrow would bring, but time has a way of eroding certainty. What they saw as excess was purpose. What they mocked as clumsy was precision. They believed war was an art, a dance of men and machines. They didn't yet realize it had already become an industry. They had earned their pride the hard way. For years they ruled the sky with nothing but instinct, precision, and a machine so graceful it seemed to defy gravity itself. The men who stood on that airfield were not dreamers. They were craftsmen of death, masters of motion. Each victory had shaped them. Each duel in the clouds had reaffirmed their belief that skill and courage alone decided the outcome of war. To them, the sky was sacred ground, and they were its chosen guardians. Every turn, every dive, every bullet fired carried the weight of their tradition. Their code was simple: fight clean, strike true, die with honor, if you must. They had seen opponents before reckless, mechanical, blunt, and they had watched them burn. The world below changed, but up here above the clouds their creed endured. Their machines reflected that creed. Lightweight, precise, stripped of excess, built for the hands of a true pilot rather than the mind of an engineer. The aircraft was not just steel and rivets, it was an extension of their bodies, their will, their soul. When they flew, it was not battle, it was art. They trusted feel over numbers, instinct over instruments. They had no need for thick armor or heavy firepower. They did not plan to get hit. Their advantage was movement itself, the elegance of evasion, the perfection of control. They could make the sky bend to their rhythm, and their enemies clumsy and slow always fell behind, consumed by frustration before they were consumed by fire. The training that created such men was brutal by design. Only the few survived it. They spent years in isolation, stripped of comfort, molded by repetition until instinct replaced thought. Every maneuver had to become a reflex, every reaction a language of precision. They learned to read the wind, to feel the weight of altitude in their bones. There was no second chance, no luxury of error. Their leaders taught them that to hesitate was to die, and to die well was still to serve. When they finally earned their wings, they did so not as students, but as disciples of a philosophy that had been tested in real combat and written in blood. They fought their wars in the open sky with an almost religious devotion. For them, combat was not chaos, it was ceremony. The enemy was not an abstract target, but a rival worthy of respect, a mirror against which they measured their worth. Victory was a reflection of mastery, and mastery required purity. Anything less, a plain, too heavy a tactic, too cautious, was an insult to that purity. Theirs was a creed of elegance over endurance, precision over brute strength. And for a long time, it worked. In the early years of their dominance, no one could touch them. Their enemies came in waves, fast, loud, desperate, but they were all defeated the same way by calm precision. Reports spoke of kill ratios so lopsided they sounded like myth. Entire formations had vanished against a handful of these pilots. Each engagement reaffirmed what they already believed, that the essence of victory lived in the pilot, not in the machine. The machine was merely the brush, the sky, the canvas, and the kill, the signature. The idea that any other philosophy could surpass that was to them unthinkable. Even when the first signs of resistance appeared, an enemy that refused to engage on their terms, they dismissed it as luck or poor piloting. They couldn't imagine a world where technology, mass production, and methodical discipline could replace individual brilliance. They had built their legend on the myth of the perfect warrior, and myths do not die easily. Their command structure reinforced it, their culture worshipped it, and their victories seemed to justify it. Pride had become a survival mechanism. To question it would be to question everything they had lived for. Yet beneath the pride, there were whispers of unease. The sky was not as forgiving as before. The faces of new enemies seemed younger, their tactics more unpredictable, their machines faster, heavier, more resilient. The veterans noticed it first, the way their own planes strained at high speed, the way their once effortless maneuvers required more risk. But pride silenced doubt. They told themselves that no machine, no matter how powerful, could replace human instinct. Their faith in their way of war remained unbroken. It was this unyielding faith that shaped their laughter when they heard of the new threat, the heavy machine from across the ocean. They didn't see innovation. They saw arrogance. To them, weight was weakness, armor was fear, and power was waste. They could not yet understand that what they dismissed as inefficiency was purpose. They had been so long at the top that they mistook familiarity for invincibility. The air itself had become their accomplice, the horizon their ally. They believed the future would continue to unfold just as the past had, under their control at their pace. But time was already turning against them. The world below had changed quietly, relentlessly. Factories replaced tradition, algorithms replaced instinct, and the sky itself was being rewritten by a new language of war, one built not on artistry, but on systems. Still they stood tall, their machines gleaming, their confidence unbroken, unaware that every hour of calm was one closer to the storm. They had lived as legends for too long to see that legends too have limits. And soon the world that had worshipped them would meet the world that would erase them. Their mastery was real, but mastery alone would no longer be enough. The old way was beautiful, but beauty was about to meet its reckoning. The sky that once belonged to them was about to change hands forever. Defeat has a way of forcing clarity. While the masters of the old sky still reveled in their myth across the ocean, another kind of warrior was learning in silence. The reports of losses, the names of men who never returned, and the wreckage pulled from smoking seas had become the new language of progress. Each mistake was studied, each death catalogued, each weakness dissected. Where pride once blinded others, these men chose to see. The factories did not mourn. They measured. The engineers did not pray. They calculated. In every broken machine they found instruction. And in that instruction, they began to shape something different. Not beautiful, not graceful, but unstoppable. The need for change did not arrive as inspiration. It came as pain. Pilots wrote home about being outturned, outclimbed, outmaneuvered, and outmatched. Commanders listened. Engineers took notes. What had once been the domain of lone aces now became the responsibility of an entire system. The new philosophy was born not from glory, but from survival. It began with humility, the acceptance that no man, no matter how skilled, could overcome a flaw in design. The answer was not to build heroes, but to build consistency, to make victory replicable. The age of instinct was fading. The age of calculation was rising. In the workshops where steel met fire, the shift in thinking was almost imperceptible at first. There were no speeches, no banners, no declarations. Just men working through the night, surrounded by the scent of oil and sweat, their hands blackened, their minds restless. They were not artists. They were architects of a new doctrine. They listened to pilots who had barely escaped death and asked them to repeat the details again and again. The angles, the sounds, the seconds between life and impact. Out of these fragments of terror, they built understanding. Every failure became a blueprint. They studied the enemy's machines, tracing each curve, measuring every flaw, identifying where beauty had replaced protection. They saw the truth behind the legend: lightness was not strength. It was fragility disguised as grace. In those notes, a new belief was forming. A belief that survival was not cowardice, that armor was not waste, that weight could be purpose. They didn't want a plane that danced, they wanted one that endured. If the old warriors fought as duelists, the new ones would fight as tacticians. If their enemy worshipped elegance, they would embrace function. The new doctrine valued endurance over flourish, cooperation over pride. Engineers stopped designing for perfection and started designing for people: for the pilot who might make mistakes, for the recruit who had never seen combat, for the mechanic who had to fix it with trembling hands in the dark. It wasn't about creating the ultimate machine. It was about creating a dependable one, a plane that could take punishment, that could fly again tomorrow, that could bring its pilot home to fight another day. It was not the art of war, it was its mathematics. Every piece of this creation was born from adaptation. The cockpit was armored because someone had been lost to shrapnel. The tanks were sealed because someone had burned alive. The guns were multiplied because one pilot had said, "I didn't have enough fire." It was not pride that guided them. It was memory. And memory has a sharper edge than honor. They weren't designing for legends. They were designing for the living. Slowly, piece by piece, the mockery of their opponents became the foundation of something indestructible. The philosophy hardened as the design evolved. The new machine was not meant to chase or dance. It was meant to dictate. Power replaced grace. Speed replaced maneuver. Fire replaced finesse. Its heart was a massive engine, a beast of controlled violence, surrounded by steel, wrapped in armor, armed with brutal precision. To the outside world it looked excessive, ungainly, almost clumsy. But those who understood its intent saw a weapon built not for vanity, but for inevitability. It didn't need to be beautiful. It only needed to win. Behind every bolt and plate of metal was a quiet revolution in thought. Commanders began to view warfare as an equation, not a duel. The aim was no longer to outfly a rival. It was to outproduce, outtrain, and outlast him. Every plane that returned from battle carried data. Every report added to a growing map of lessons. War became a feedback loop, a living organism learning how to kill more efficiently. And in this relentless cycle, emotion gave way to method. The new machine was not born from passion, but from precision. It was the physical embodiment of discipline. Meanwhile, those who had laughed at its design continued to believe they were fighting men. They didn't realize they were fighting systems. The system could lose a pilot and replace him. It could lose a plane and build two more. It could learn faster than they could adapt. That was its true genius, not in speed or power or armor, but in its ability to evolve. The old warriors didn't see the danger yet, because danger to them had always worn a face. This one wore a process. By the time the mockery began to fade, it was already too late. In secret hangars, the new weapon waited, tested, refined, recalibrated. It didn't shimmer with elegance or poetry. It hummed with inevitability. The men who built it knew it would never be adored, but they also knew it would never fail. What had begun as a response to humiliation had transformed into something greater, a machine shaped not by pride, but by purpose. And somewhere across the ocean, as laughter echoed through tents and hangars, that purpose was taking form. The weapon they dismissed as heavy, slow, and foolish was awakening, cold, precise, and unstoppable. The sky would soon belong not to the artists, but to the architects. The era of mastery was ending. The era of method had begun. The thing they mocked was being forged quietly in the shadows, and it was almost ready. The day the two philosophies finally met was neither grand nor expected. It began with silence, an empty sky, the low hum of engines, and a haze of heat trembling over the horizon. The veterans of the old creed took to the air, as they always had, confident, sharp, and certain of their rhythm. They climbed with elegance banking, with ease sunlight, glinting off the thin wings that had carried them through so many triumphs. To them, this was just another hunt. Another lesson to teach those who thought machines could replace mastery. They scanned the clouds for movement ready for a duel. But the duel never came. The new weapon arrived without warning. It didn't glide. It struck. Out of the high sun came a shape that seemed wrong to the eye. Too large, too heavy, too brutal to belong in the same sky. Yet it moved with a speed that tore through expectation. The veterans had no time to admire or mock. The fight had already begun. The heavy plane didn't circle or chase. It dove. A flash of light, a line of tracers. Then, gone. The old fighters turned instinctively searching for their attacker, but there was nothing in their sightlines, only the fading contrail and the realization that something had just changed. The first encounter was chaos disguised as precision. The veterans tried to pull the fight into the dance they knew so well, turning sharply, climbing into the wind, waiting for the enemy to follow. But the new machines refused. They didn't play. They dictated. Each time one dove, it killed. Each time it climbed, it vanished. The duel had become an execution. The men who had built their lives on instinct found themselves chasing ghosts, reacting to an enemy that no longer shared their logic. Every rule of the sky had been rewritten in seconds. At first, disbelief carried them. They had survived worse odds. They had faced storms, fire, and swarms of lesser foes. But this was different. This enemy didn't fight with fury, it fought with method. Its pilots moved like extensions of a plan, not men. They didn't risk glory, they ensured results. When the old masters tried to bait them into close combat, they refused. When they attempted to climb, the heavy engines of their opponents roared past them, turning altitude into dominance. And when they tried to flee, the new fighters' guns spoke the final word. The sky that once felt like home had become a labyrinth they no longer understood. Reports later described the engagement as brief. But inside the cockpits, it felt eternal. Every second stretched, filled with disbelief and confusion. The first kill shattered their rhythm. The second broke their confidence. And by the third, the myth itself began to crack. The veterans' elegant maneuvers, once their signature, became liabilities. Their agility could not save them from speed and firepower that came from angles they could neither predict nor counter. They felt the sting of reality. Skill without advantage was no longer skill. It was vanity. Meanwhile, in the cockpits of the new machines, the air was calm. The men inside were not legends or artists. They were professionals, executing a plan. Each strike was measured, each retreat calculated. They climbed high, struck fast, and never lingered. They spoke little on the radio, only coordinates, commands, confirmations. There was no poetry in their work, no flourish, no emotion. They were part of a system, and that system was working flawlessly. From their altitude, they could see the enemy below, twisting desperately in the sunlight, elegant but doomed. The old guard began to feel it, not fear, but something deeper, disorientation. The world they had mastered was collapsing in real time. The rhythm they had trusted, the physics they had memorized, no longer applied. Their planes strained at high speed, controls stiff engines, gasping. The new fighters thrived in that same environment built for it. The duelists of the sky found themselves dragged into a war of momentum and energy, one they could not win. For the first time, their instincts betrayed them. Every turn they made became a target. Every climb became exposure. The radio channels filled with confusion. Calls for support, half-finished warnings, voices breaking. The veterans' formation fractured, not from panic, but from disbelief. They were not losing to men, they were losing to an idea. A doctrine that had replaced intuition with precision, courage with coordination. They tried to fight as they always had, individually, heroically, but heroism no longer mattered. The enemy's teamwork was surgical. Where one plane engaged, another covered. Where one missed, another finished. It was not chaos, it was orchestration. When the final shots were fired, the sky fell quiet again. Smoke trails drifted down like fading signatures on a page. The survivors returned, not as conquerors, but as witnesses. They spoke of a machine that refused to turn, of an enemy that seemed untouchable, of tactics that made no sense until it was too late. Pride had been their armor. Now it was their wound. They could not yet see the full scale of what had begun, but they understood one truth. The age of individual mastery had just ended. The commanders who received those reports didn't celebrate. They analyzed. They marked every maneuver, every result. To them, this was not just a victory, it was validation. The doctrine worked. The experiment had succeeded. The system had proven itself in blood. The engineers who had once been dismissed as dreamers were suddenly the architects of destiny. The laughter that had once echoed in distant tents had gone silent. The old world had been built on pride, precision, and perfection. The new one was built on adaptation, coordination, and control. That day's battle was small in number, but infinite in meaning. It wasn't a skirmish. It was a transition, a line drawn in the air between eras. The men who fought it didn't know they were witnessing history. They were too busy surviving it. But history had already taken note. That first encounter was not just a fight. It was a revelation. The myth had met the machine, and the myth had bled. The sky no longer belonged to the artists. It belonged to the engineers, to the planners, to the system that never slept. And as the smoke cleared and the echoes faded, one truth remained. Undeniable, this wasn't just a victory. It was a declaration. A new order had claimed the heavens. What began as disbelief soon hardened into silence. The veterans who had once filled the sky with confidence now flew through emptiness, fewer of them, each day, their formations thinner, their radio channels haunted by static instead of laughter. The losses mounted quietly at first, then like a flood. The names on the mission board began to vanish faster than new ones could be added. They weren't just losing battles anymore. They were losing continuity, identity, and the myth that had once protected them from fear. For every experienced pilot who fell, there was no equal to replace him. What returned to the airfields were boys, barely trained, terrified behind the controls of machines they didn't fully understand. The cycle that had once forged legends was now devouring them. The old system had built itself around perfection. Years of training, years of ritual, years of cultivating instinct. But war no longer had the patience for perfection. The new enemy didn't rely on time. It manufactured efficiency. Where the old masters spent years creating one ace, the new system produced squadrons by the hundreds. Factories ran day and night, birthing machines faster than they could be destroyed. Training programs ran like assembly lines, standardized, repeatable, relentless. Every pilot was replaceable, every plane a component. The art of war had been industrialized. It was no longer about who flew better, but who could sustain the storm longer. Inside the command posts, the difference became impossible to ignore. Reports spoke not of duels, but of annihilation. The enemy's waves seemed endless, mechanical, methodical, almost impersonal. Each lost squadron was replaced within days. Each broken machine was rebuilt before the wreckage cooled. What the old order had once mocked as soulless efficiency had become unstoppable endurance. Their own production lines sputtered under blockade and exhaustion. Resources dwindled, fuel, rationed, replacement parts scavenged. The veterans could feel it every time they touched their controls, the sluggish response, the fading power. Their machines, once symbols of grace, now groaned like relics against an enemy that seemed to multiply faster than thought itself. The spirit that had once defined them began to fracture. The younger pilots no longer shared the same faith in the code of honor. They fought without conviction, obeying orders with the numb obedience of survival. The few who still believed the aces who had lived through the rise and fall fought harder, desperate to preserve the dignity of a dying creed. But belief cannot stop attrition. Their skies were no longer sanctuaries of mastery. They were production floors for death. Every sortie felt more mechanical, every victory smaller, every return emptier. They had become ghosts inside the myth they once embodied. The contrast between the two worlds grew unbearable. Across the ocean, the enemy's command centers hummed like heartbeats. Radar arrays stretched across the seas, guiding interceptors with mathematical precision. Combat no longer began with a pilot's intuition. but with a signal, a calculation, a system. Coordination replaced instinct. Data replaced intuition. The battlefield had become a network, not an arena. The very idea of a duel had become obsolete. The old warriors, still clinging to the poetry of their code, now fought against equations, and equations do not miss. As the defeats mounted, the leaders of the old order doubled down on pride. They refused to adapt, refused to dilute the purity of their doctrine. Their pride was not arrogance, it was survival. To admit their way had failed was to admit that everything they had ever stood for was meaningless. So they taught new recruits the same old tactics even as those recruits died using them. They spoke of honor while rationing fuel, spoke of mastery while flying with trembling hands. Tradition had turned into a burden too heavy to bear, but too sacred to abandon. Meanwhile, the system they fought against grew stronger with every engagement. It didn't need heroes, it built results. Every pilot it trained lived long enough to become experienced. Every experienced pilot trained others. The loop was self-sustaining. It was no longer about brilliance. It was about longevity. The new doctrine understood a truth the old order could never accept. Survival was not the opposite of honor. It was the foundation of victory. The war had become a contest of endurance, and endurance favors the systematic. The veterans began to sense the futility. They could feel it in their bones each time they climbed into the cockpit. The weight of inevitability pressing down harder than gravity. They flew because it was all they knew, but the sky had changed. It no longer welcomed them. Their elegance, once celebrated, now felt out of place, an echo from another age. The maneuvers that had once drawn admiration now ended in flames. The enemies they once pitied now dictated the pace of the war. They weren't fighting opponents anymore. They were fighting the future. By the final month's defeat, no longer came as shock, it came as routine. The airfields were quieter, the laughter gone, the air heavy with resignation. Even the surviving aces, men who had once been immortalized, walked with hollow eyes. They spoke less about tactics, more about memory. They watched the skies fill with the new machines, bigger, faster, louder machines that didn't belong to their world. They could only admire their power with the same reverence they once demanded for their own. It was a cruel symmetry, the hunters watching their successors rise powerless to resist. And as the war machines of the new era carved the sky into grids of efficiency, the old masters understood what had truly been lost. Not just battles, not just comrades, but meaning itself. The poetry of flight had been replaced by arithmetic. The duel had been replaced by doctrine. The art they had lived and died for had been mechanized beyond recognition. And yet, deep down, they could not deny the truth of it. The system worked. The age of the artist was over. The last remnants of the old guard did not fall with defiance. They fell with dignity, aware that history had moved beyond them. They had fought beautifully, but beauty no longer mattered. What had once been an art was now an equation, and equations have no room for pride. As the engines of the new order thundered overhead, drowning out the last whispers of the old creed, they could only watch the horizon fade. The world they built had been devoured by the one they refused to believe in. From that day forward, war would never again be a test of spirit. It had become machinery, and they no longer belonged to it. Years later, when the noise had faded and the skies were quiet again, the survivors walked among the wreckage of what had once been their world. The fields where hangars once stood were silent, now scattered with rusted frames and broken glass. The smell of oil had long vanished, replaced by grass and rain. Time had reclaimed everything except the memories. The men who had lived through that transformation carried it with them like a scar, invisible yet unhealed. They were no longer warriors, only witnesses. The war had ended, but its meaning lingered unresolved. The veterans of the old order lived long enough to see their machines displayed behind glass labeled as relics. Tourists admired them for their beauty, the curves, the craftsmanship, the simplicity, and called them art. It was an irony that stung. The same beauty that had once made them proud had also doomed them. They had fought with elegance while the world learned to fight with endurance. They had worshipped the duel while their enemies built systems. Standing before their own legends, they began to understand that perfection without adaptation is just another form of fragility. Those who had once laughed at the idea of machinery replacing mastery now watched a new generation born into a world built entirely by that idea. They saw pilots trained by simulators, guided by instruments, backed by networks that stretched across oceans. There were no duels anymore, no solitary contests of skill. Victory now came from precision coordination and the cold hum of data. It should have felt soulless, but it didn't. They realized that the spirit of what they had once believed in had not died. It had evolved. What had been instinct was now information. What had been artistry was now discipline. The essence remained. It had simply changed its form. In conversations shared over quiet drinks or in dim museums, they spoke not of defeat, but of perspective. One of them said, almost in disbelief, "We fought for purity. They fought for survival. We lost, but they built something that could endure." That sentence lingered. It wasn't resentment, it was revelation. The realization that progress often feels like betrayal to those left behind. The creed of honor, the faith in human mastery had not been wrong. It had just reached its limit. The world had outgrown its mythology. The engineers who had once been dismissed as soulless mechanics became the new philosophers of war. Their victory was not built on glory, but on method. They had proven that intelligence could be its own form of courage, that precision could replace passion, that endurance could be as noble as artistry. They hadn't just won a conflict, they had rewritten the language of it. Their machines were not merely weapons, they were ideas made tangible. The old pilots in time came to respect that. They had seen what arrogance could destroy and what humility could build. Yet beneath that acceptance was an ache that never left. The veterans knew what had been lost: the intimacy of combat, the connection between man and machine, the poetry of motion. The skies had become colder, quieter, more efficient. The beauty they once knew had been traded for certainty. They did not despise the new world for it. They simply mourned the warmth of their own. It was not bitterness. It was the melancholy of understanding. They had lived at the end of something irreplaceable, and they had witnessed the birth of something inevitable. Both truths coexisted, and neither could be denied. Time softened the edges of ideology. Decades later, young historians and aviators sought them out, eager to hear from the last living masters of the old sky. They listened to their stories with reverence, wide-eyed at the courage and discipline it took to fight as they did. And sometimes, after a long silence, the old men would smile faintly and say, "We were the last of our kind." But their tone carried no bitterness. It carried respect for what came after. They no longer spoke of victory or defeat, only of evolution. The lesson was clear. War had changed because humanity had changed. What once required instinct could now be taught. What once demanded sacrifice could now be measured. And what once was chaos could now be controlled. The legacy of their struggle lived not in monuments or medals, but in philosophy. They had been the bridge between eras, the proof that courage and innovation were not opposites, but stages of the same truth. The machine had not replaced the man. It had amplified him. The pilots who flew later generations of aircraft did so with systems that embodied every lesson their predecessors had paid for in blood. Every advancement, every safety feature, every doctrine of teamwork had been born from those early failures. The mockery, the arrogance, the pride, the fall, they were all part of the cost of progress. In the end, the old survivors found peace not in triumph, but in continuity. They came to understand that their downfall had given birth to resilience, that their losses had bought wisdom. The young did not need to repeat their mistakes because the past had already paid the price. Standing beneath the quiet roar of modern jets, they could almost feel their own ghosts in the sound, the echo of every dive, every scream of wind, every burst of fire that had once defined their sky. And for the first time, they felt not sorrow, but gratitude, because now they understood. Progress is never kind, but it is always honest. The world they had lost had not been stolen. It had been transformed. The laughter that once mocked the new had faded into reverence for its necessity. The myth of invincibility had given way to the discipline of adaptation. And as they looked to the sky one last time, they knew what history had tried to tell them all along. In every age, what mankind laughs at today becomes the instrument that defines tomorrow. In the end, the story was never just about machines or battles. It was about the inevitable march of change, about how pride gives way to understanding, and how even defeat can leave behind a legacy of progress. The sky that once echoed with the thunder of duels now hums with quiet precision, guided by systems born from the lessons of those who refused to yield. The men who once laughed, who once ruled the heavens with instinct and grace, became the silent architects of everything that followed. Their triumphs shaped the art of flight, their failures shaped its future. Time, as always, was the final teacher. What had seemed like loss became foundation. The philosophies that clashed in smoke and fire merged into a new truth that mastery and machinery, instinct and intellect, are not enemies, but reflections of each other. Humanity had learned to balance them, to turn arrogance into awareness, and awareness into advancement. And so the legend endures not as a monument to glory, but as a reminder of transformation. Those who once soared by faith alone gave birth to those who soar by knowledge. The machines may have changed, the doctrines may have evolved, but the soul of flight, the courage to rise against gravity and defy the limits of what was thought possible, remains the same. The laughter that once filled the hangars has long since faded, replaced by the hum of progress. But if you listen closely, somewhere in that hum is an echo, a whisper from the past, still alive within every wing that cuts the sky. Because in every age, what humanity mocks today becomes the force that defines its tomorrow.